Hello, my name is Wade R. Goria, and I'm submitting this video to the Infowars Patriot Challenge. A nation is defined as a group of people who share a common language, a common culture, a common sense of history and destiny. That's the essential element of a nation. And what we have today is a nation, but with a great many people who have absolutely no idea about the collective experience of the people who made this country what it is. There is a terrible dearth of knowledge for far too many people living in our nation who understand what we've endured, what we have encountered during the 240 or so years that this country has been in existence. It's a dangerous situation. Now, what's the reason for this? Well, first, let's take a look at how people derive their sense of history. It comes from schools, which are doing a pretty rotten job for the most part. It comes from films. Today, there are precious few films that have explored American history, Hollywood productions. I can think of one big Hollywood blockbuster offhand, The Patriot, with Mel Gibson. But it's a fact that there's never been a major movie made about George Washington or Benjamin Franklin or John Adams or Thomas Jefferson. And what's up with that? Why hasn't Hollywood seen fit to make an major American production about one of the founding fathers? I'm talking about this situation, which I think is an extremely important one, and perhaps a little bit of background about myself will sort of put this into context. I live in the Bay Ridge section of Brooklyn. I grew up in Brooklyn. I was born in Manhattan, but raised all my life in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. Now, those of you who are not familiar with Bay Ridge, it's on the southwestern side of the island of Long Island. Long Island is about 100 miles long, and Brooklyn is actually western Long Island. And I grew up in a great place. I had a view of New York Harbor. I could see the Statue of Liberty. I could see the entire New York skyline, all the way to the Verrazano Bridge, which is where the ocean meets the harbor. And so it was a great place to grow up. My father is originally from Roanoke, Virginia. And because of that, I used to go down to Virginia all the time. And my dad sensed, probably by the age of 4 or 5, that I was very big on the Civil War. Something about it captured my imagination. And my dad was very, very good to make sure that we saw Civil War battlefields, that we went to Appomattox, and we went to all the different places that are associated with the Civil War in Virginia. I think it's fair to say, but by the age of 6, I was kind of an historical fanatic. I majored in history in college. I went to Oxford University and studied history and international relations. And when I was 21 years old, I founded the Bay Ridge Historical Society. And Bay Ridge itself has an amazing history. I think if you asked most people about Bay Ridge, they'd probably know nothing in an historical context. But Bay Ridge is the place where the first shot fired against British warships after the Declaration of Independence took place. And the heights that exist right where Fort Hamilton overlooks Gravesend Bay, the first resistance to the British after the Declaration takes place. The first place where a flag was raised after the issuance of the Declaration of Independence took place at the New Utrecht Church, which was a Dutch Reformed church, and there was a gigantic liberty pole, and a flag was raised, symbolizing that Brooklyn, which was probably more of a Tory place, had a very strong patriotic element. Now, The American Revolution, in many ways, is intimately connected with Bay Ridge and with Brooklyn. And a lot of people don't know that. And for instance, I'd like to ask you a question, and let's test the InfoWarrior's knowledge of history. In what place was the largest battle of the American Revolution fought? And the answer is Brooklyn. Where were more people killed than in any other colony? As a matter of fact, more people lost their lives in Brooklyn for the cause of liberty than in all the 13 colonies combined, keeping in mind that Brooklyn was then a part of the New York colony. The answer is Brooklyn. Brooklyn has tremendous credentials to be part of the American Revolutionary experience. And the largest pitched battle of the American Revolution was fought just a few miles from my house, in and around the area of Prospect Park and Greenwood Cemetery, one of the great historic cemeteries of the United States. The largest armada that was ever assembled in human history by the British was assembled right just about a mile from my house in Gravesend Bay, where the British landed a force of about 35 to 40,000 men, and for the purpose of seizing control of New York City, then considered a very, very important key to controlling the 13 colonies. And just a word about that, the British were very anxious to cut off the New England colonies. They could do this if they gained control over New York City and the Hudson River. And the people in New England would then be cut off from the western frontier, properly isolated, and then crushed. Now, on August 27th, 1776, the largest battle of the American Revolution was fought. It was not a victory for the American forces. Unfortunately for George Washington, the overwhelming strength of the British, its naval and armed forces, just couldn't be stopped. And Washington made after the disaster that took place in and around Prospect Park and today's Greenwood Cemetery, Washington very wisely decided to retreat. And he did that roughly where the River Cafe is today, very close to the Brooklyn Bridge. And there's a plaque that marks the spot. By the way, I installed that plaque along with the president of the Brooklyn Historical Society, James P. Hurley. That plaque traveled in my car and was installed, marking the spot where Washington, in a Dunkirk-like operation, evacuated over 9,000 American troops over to Manhattan, saving the American Revolution. Now, the British were stopped by a terrible northeaster that brought unfavorable winds that prevented the British from fully attacking. And there was also a very thick fog, which gave Colonel Glover, who commanded the fishermen of Marblehead, Massachusetts, enabled Washington to make his way across the East River under the most difficult conditions and save the American Revolution. Now, after New York City was conquered, the reaction of the British was ferocious towards the American people. And this is where I think a lot of people don't have a very clear idea about the history of New York City during the American Revolution. Most people who think of the American Revolution will think of Lexington, which was, of course, the battle that in a sense, the Americans stopped the British before they could take our guns away from us, which were stored in Concord. People think about Lexington. They think of the Battle of Bunker Hill in Boston. They certainly will think about the triumphant victory at Yorktown in 1781. But they won't think about what happened in New York City. Washington lost the battle. But then there is what we might call a globalist occupation of New York City. And this is what I think people need to know about. The average American, and perhaps even the InfoWarriors, who are much better prepared and more knowledgeable about their history than the average person. So what takes place? Well, the British are ruthless. They capture every available patriot and imprison them. Anyone who they suspect was sympathetic to the cause, any of the captured prisoners, now there was the largest pitched battle of the American Revolution took place at the Cortelli Vecchi House, which today is located on 3rd Street right near 4th Avenue. And it's become a very vibrant historical society and a place for lots of cultural and historical meetings. A lot of those men who fought under William Alexander, Lord Stirling, who was an American, who claimed a Scottish ancestry, were captured. These were men from Maryland. And this heroic stand by the men of Maryland is something that has been very much remembered by historians. Now, this Patriot Challenge concerns what happened once the British took over control of New York City. Washington's troops made their way up Manhattan. They fought a number of battles in White Plains. They came down to the area of what is today referred to as Fort Washington in the Washington Heights section of Manhattan, where they made their last stand. And then Washington escaped across the Hudson River over to approximately where Fort Lee, New Jersey is today, and then continued his campaign in New Jersey. But we want to go back to Brooklyn, because it's at this time that the British are now going to take full control over Brooklyn. After Washington leaves Manhattan, they will consolidate their control over Manhattan. Many of the wealthiest houses who were supporters of the Patriots were destroyed by British warships, including a house where many meetings took place with Alexander Hamilton on the very site that Gracie Mansion, the home of the New York City mayor, is located. Gunships completely pulverized that house, and it was later rebuilt by Archibald Gracie, and it would eventually become Gracie Mansion. The British would torture Americans. For instance, I give tours of New York City by boat. And harbor tours, I do about 8 of them a year. And one of the tours that I take, these are tours that go around the island of Staten Island. They go up the Hudson River. They go up the East River to Long Island Sound. And they go to down to New Jersey, Sandy Hook, and Atlantic Highlands, which is really the entrance to New York City in many ways, in a maritime sense. And I give these tours on behalf of the National Lighthouse Museum, a great organization which is based in Staten Island. And one of my tours up the East River takes you all the way to Sands Point on the Long Island Sound, takes you to Execution Rocks. Now, Execution Rocks has a long and lurid history that I'm not going to go into now. But I would like to mention that the British were getting exasperated capturing Americans and hanging them in public, because Americans like Nathan Hale would say things like, "I regret that I have but one life to give to my country," before he was hanged, and that would only create more people interested in the Patriot cause. So the British decided that they would chain Americans to the rocks of what is today Execution Lighthouse, and watch the tide as it went over them, watching these poor souls gasp for life before they drowned. This was the kind of torture that was very popular for the British. The British hired mercenaries, many of them coming from Hesse, the German province, or Hesse. And the Hessian soldiers were noted for being extremely ruthless, bloodless, and unbelievably vicious. Many of the soldiers that had fought in Brooklyn were rounded up by Hessians, bayoneted, skewered against trees, where their entrails would be ripped out sadistically by the Hessians, and these poor men would be left to die, while many of the Hessians would laugh at the kind of torture that was inflicted upon them. Americans in Brooklyn were rounded up in great numbers. Anyone who was at all sympathetic to the cause, anybody certainly who had fought in the battle, anyone who had any connections to Patriots were rounded up. And here's where the story really begins for our Patriot Challenge. Because I don't think most of you listening to this video understand just how much the people of Brooklyn suffered during the American Revolution. The Battle of Brooklyn was in 1776. It would not be until 1783 that the British would finally evacuate from New York City. And here's another statistic that might surprise you. As I said, the largest number of people before who died during the American Revolution died in Brooklyn. Those people who died, the vast majority of them, died in prison ships that were located in Wallabout Bay, right off the coast from the present-day Brooklyn Navy Yard. The Brooklyn Navy Yard, one of the great naval yards in the history of the United States. There's so many famous ships, including the Arizona, the Missouri, the USS Monitor was built at the Brooklyn Naval Yard. Wallabout Bay surrounds that. And the British used a total of 16 prison ships to incarcerate captured prisoners of war and other people connected with the Patriot cause. Now, during this time, we have a total of from 11,000 to 12,000 men who are going to die in these terrible prison ships. Now, when I cite the death toll from 11,500 to 12,000 men killed at the on board prison ships, I'd like you to keep another statistic in mind. In all the battles that took place in the 13 colonies during the American Revolution, on the field of battle, the American Patriots lost approximately 8,000 men. So when we take the number 11,500 to 12,000 into consideration, we see that more people died right off the shore of Brooklyn in those prison ships than in the total number of places where the revolution was fought and on the total number of battles that were fought in the revolution. So it's an absolutely shocking number. The people who were kept in these ships, and perhaps the most famous, the grisliest, the most horrible story concerns the Jersey, which was the subject of a recent book by Robert Watson called Ghost Ship, which is earning a great deal of praise from historians. And he documents very, very effectively the experience of the men who were kept in the ship. Now, these ships had their masts taken down. They didn't need to have masts. And so basically the hulls became the place where the people were incarcerated. The average hold could accommodate 100, 200 people. These holds contained over 1,000 people. Dysentery, typhus, cholera, smallpox, every imaginable disease that has afflicted people with bad sanitation and terrible overcrowded conditions afflicted these ships. Many of the people died as a result of these diseases. On an average, it's been documented that a dozen men would die each day from these conditions. The men were chained to the ships. According to many accounts, the British took a sadistic delight in torturing people that they referred to as rebels. Now, from the point of view of the British, perhaps they were rebels, but these are people who call themselves Americans, who had lived always in America, and who were looking to have their own country. And for the British to imprison these people in the most god-awful, despicable conditions, allowing people to die by the dozen every day from sanitation. If you needed to go to the bathroom, you went in a bucket that was right next to you. The sanitation was horrific. And these were the kinds of conditions that the British created in their occupation. Now keep in mind, the British rested their policy on mercantilism. The theory that Britain, as a patron mother country, had the right to take over countries, utilize their natural resources and their labor so that Britain could then produce goods that would be sold back to the countries that were occupied. And this guaranteed an extremely favorable trade for the British and the increase of reserves of gold, which was absolutely essential in the economy of the 18th century. This is the heart of mercantilism. The British regarded the Americans as being part of that mercantile system. And so if the Americans were going to resist, they were just disgusting traitors, rodents who needed to be crushed. That's how the British regarded the American people. Keeping in mind that the British exercised an extraordinarily large global system of trade. And in many ways, their goal was to dominate the world through their trade and their power as a naval force. So the British were globalists in every sense of the word. Just a few days ago, I listened to Dr. Steve Pachinek, who was talking with Alex Jones and Milo Yiannopoulos, and I absolutely adore listening to Dr. Pachinek and Milo, and feel they have tremendous insights into almost everything they talk about. However, Dr. Pachinek said during a discussion that America has never really experienced an occupation. And that might be true, certainly in the post-American Revolutionary War phase. But I'd like to remind everyone listening to this video that Americans did experience the horrors of globalism. And the people who died in Brooklyn in prison ships and on the field of battle in Brooklyn, with statistics that I've already cited, are the people who know very well how terrible the British were once they got control. So to go back to Brooklyn, the British didn't seem to be terribly concerned to provide decent, humane conditions for the captured American patriots. On the contrary, the conditions could not have been more wretched. And the probably worst example of the kind of horrendous treatment that the Patriots received takes place in a ship, the HMS Jersey. And Robert Watson documents what took place on the Jersey, and reading this book, seeing other accounts of it elsewhere, is absolutely heartbreaking. Now, as the years passed after the British evacuation in 1783, Americans gradually forgot about all of those people who suffered on the prison ships. And the business of America is business, and New York City is the cradle of business in the United States. So people went about their affairs. Some of the grave sites were covered over by industrial sites. As I mentioned before, a great deal of documentation had taken place, so there was a fairly good idea about at least the numbers and the names of the people who died on these ships. And during as the 19th century progressed, we see, for instance, Walt Whitman making reference to the prison ship martyrs in his poetry. And we hear people more and more talking about there being a need for a great repository, a monument that would honor all of the people who died on these prison ships. Well, a movement took place in the latter part of the 19th century, which eventually culminated in the establishment of the official name is the Prison Ship Martyrs Memorial, and it's located in Fort Greene, Brooklyn. Now, just again for your patriotic information, how many of you out there can tell us much about Greene, Nathaniel Greene? Do you know much about him? If you don't, I'm happy to share some of my knowledge about Nathaniel Greene. Nathaniel Greene was the favorite general of General George Washington. He was considered to be the wisest, coolest under pressure, and most capable both strategic and tactical commander. In many ways, Nathaniel Greene was indispensable to George Washington. At Washington Heights, it was really Greene who persuaded General Washington to make his retreat across the Hudson River over to New Jersey. Remember, as Thomas Paine would later say, these are the times that try men's souls. This was a very difficult time. It's Nathaniel Greene who is going to discover Alexander Hamilton. And it was Alexander Hamilton that would so impress General Washington that he would become his aide-de-camp at the age of 19. And Nathaniel Greene went shoulder to shoulder with General Washington, and then later he would lead the Southern campaign. Greene's nickname was the Savior of the South, and he had another nickname, the Fighting Quaker, and that was in reference to his background. His father, who was both a farmer and a smith, was of Quaker background, and Greene was originally from Rhode Island. Now, it was Greene who really kept the American Revolution alive in the South. Again, the military history is complicated and sometimes difficult to remember, but Washington spent a good deal of the American Revolution in places like Newburgh, New York, and he relied on General Greene to keep the Army and the hopes of the Revolution alive in the South, in states like Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So Greene is memorialized in Brooklyn with a beautiful park, that borders DeKalb Avenue, and is the site of what became the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument. Now, this is the monument that eventually contained the remains of all the 11,500 to 12,000 men who died in those prison ships, and a very large and impressive crypt was constructed honoring these men, and a beautiful Doric column was built atop that crypt. The column is 149 feet high. It's made of granite. It sits atop a staircase that's 100 feet wide and has 33 steps. At the top of the column is an 8-ton brazier, or funeral urn, that was designed by a very famous sculptor, Adolf Weinman, and President William Howard Taft delivered the address that symbolized the opening of the monument in 1908. Now, I knew nothing as a child about the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument. Not a single teacher had ever told me about it. And no public service announcement ever told me about it. No movie ever mentioned anything about the monument. And so it really wasn't until I was in college that I first learned about this monument. And it was because I was doing research on the Battle of Brooklyn with a military history professor who actually led the Hungarian Revolution, General Béla Király, who was one of my greatest professors. And in the course of learning about the very important role that that Brooklyn played in the American Revolution, I came across the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument. I'd like to share with you something that I recently read in Robert Watson's book, Ghost Ship. And it contains a passage from Dr. Charles E. West, who addressed a group of students at the Brooklyn Heights Seminary in 1895. And here's what Dr. West had to say. For some unaccountable reason, has been omitted from the leading American histories, and very many ordinary, well-informed people know practically nothing of the unparalleled cruelty of the British or the unflinching courage of the patriots who met martyrs' deaths in defense of their country. West gave the address well over a century after the death of these men in the prison ships. And the years that have passed since 1895, people are still just as ignorant about what happened in Brooklyn during the American Revolution. I'd like to thank Alex Jones and the Infowars for the magnificent work they have done on behalf of America. I'd like to close my presentation with these important words. A society that fails to honor those patriots who made our freedom possible will not enjoy freedom tomorrow.